On 21st July 1997, an event took place in the town of Vyatskie Polyani in the Kirov region that shook the whole of Russia. A young woman with a child in her arms entered the local police station and told a story so difficult to believe that even seasoned investigators found it hard to accept. She claimed that in the center of the city, in an ordinary garage belonging to the Ideal Cooperative, there was a real concentration camp underground where women were being held in slavery. When the task force arrived at the address and broke down the garage door, they discovered a carefully concealed hatch. What lay 9 meters underground exceeded even their darkest expectations. The bunker, measuring only 15 square meters, was a veritable underground prison. The walls of the room were lined with old mattresses for soundproofing, so that the cries of the captives could not be heard above ground. In this stuffy room, with no windows and no proper ventilation, there were 2 sewing machines, several tables, and beds. The air was stale, saturated with the smell of human excrement and fear. The staircase leading down was electrified with high voltage so that the prisoners could not attempt to escape without risking being electrocuted. It was a perfect trap, with no way out. There were 2 exhausted women in the bunker. They were emaciated, their bodies covered with bruises and scars from beatings. But the most frightening thing was what the police saw on their foreheads. The word slave was burned into their foreheads, and tattoos in the form of tear lines were carved under their eyes. These marks were made roughly, without anesthesia, and the wounds healed poorly and festered. The women trembled with fear, not understanding what had happened, afraid that this was another sadistic game of their tormentor. The story of this nightmare began much earlier. On 24 May 1953, Alexander Komin was born in Vyatskie Polyani. He grew up in a family of ordinary workers, did not stand out among his peers, and was an average student. After 8th grade, he dropped out of school and, at the age of 18, was sent to prison for 3 years for hooliganism. It was behind bars that Komin heard a story that became the starting point for his future crimes. One of his cellmates told him how he kept homeless people captive, who painted icons and pictures, which he then sold for profit. This idea of free labor struck a chord with Komin. In prison, Komin learned to sew and found his first passion. After his release, he received a diploma in fashion design and pattern making, but there was no work in his field. He got by with odd jobs, got married, had 2 children, but was constantly short of money. While working as a stoker, Komin met Alexander Mikheyev, an engineer by training. Recalling stories about enslaved people he had heard in prison, Komin suggested to Mikheyev that they set up their own business using slave labor. At first, they planned to have enslaved people grow vegetables and breed black cats for their skin to be used in souvenirs, but they later settled on a sewing business. In the late 1980s, Komin purchased a garage in the Ideal Cooperative. From 1990 to 1994, he and Mikheyev built an underground bunker. 4 years of hard work, digging at night, removing soil in small portions so as not to attract attention. They dug to a depth of 9 meters, creating a room measuring 15 square meters. Komin thought through every detail of this underground prison. He ran high-voltage wires up the stairs, creating a deadly trap for anyone who tried to escape. The walls were lined with mattresses for soundproofing, and tables, beds, and 2 sewing machines were installed. It was a real concentration camp, created for one purpose: to keep people in slavery and force them to work. The first victim in 1995 was Vera Tolpayeva, a resident of Vyatskie Polyani. Komin lured her with the promise of a well-paid seamstress job. When the woman went down into the bunker to look at the workplace, Komin locked the hatch. Tolpayeva tried to escape, screaming and begging to be released, but this only angered the maniac. To subdue his first slave, Komin beat her with a rubber hose and iron chains. The blows were so brutal that they left deep lacerations on the woman's body. Komin regularly raped Tolpayeva, threatening to kill her if she did not obey. But Tolpayeva lacked sewing skills. She could not sew, as Komen demanded. Then the maniac demanded that she recommend someone she knew who could work on a sewing machine. The frightened woman told him about her friend, Tatiana Melnikova, 35, a seamstress. Komen and Makiv invited Melnikova and her partner, Nikolai, to visit them and gave them vodka laced with clonazepam, a powerful sleeping pill. When the victims lost consciousness, Tatiana was taken down to the bunker, and Nikolai was stripped to his underwear and taken to a field, as they decided he was too dangerous to leave alive. But they did not kill him, hoping that he would freeze to death. Komen tortured Melnikova with particular cruelty. He demanded that she sew 32 robes a day. It was back-breaking labor, and the women worked 16 hours a day without breaks. For any disobedience, the maniac promised to cut them with a knife. He beat the prisoners with a rubber hose and iron chains, leaving terrible bruises and lacerations. The conditions of detention were appalling. The women were fed only cereals, boiled potatoes, black bread, and rosehip infusion. The portions were minimal, the captives were constantly hungry, and their bodies were emaciated. They were only allowed to wash once a week in a basin. Komen lowered a water canister to them on a winch, and this had to suffice for all their hygiene needs. A bucket served as a toilet, which was emptied every few days. There was a terrible smell in the bunker. There was no proper ventilation, and the air was stale and stuffy. Komen regularly raped both prisoners. He would come down to the bunker whenever he wanted, and the women could not resist him because they knew that refusal would result in terrible torture. The maniac took sadistic pleasure in his power over his defenseless victims. He came up with new ways to torment them to break their will completely. Later, another woman was brought to the bunker, and then Komen lured a young man named Shishov there, promising him a job. But the maniac quickly realized that the man was dangerous. Shishov was physically stronger than him and could try to escape by turning off the electricity on the stairs. Then Komen made a monstrous decision. He created a homemade electric chair. It was a construction made from an ordinary chair to which bare high-voltage wires were attached. The maniac tied Shishov to this chair. The man understood that death awaited him. He begged for mercy, promised to work, and not try to escape. Komen let him smoke his last cigarette, as if before execution in the electric chair in American prisons. Then he wrapped the bare wires around the victim's arm and leg and ordered the enslaved women to press the buttons on the switches. Melnikova refused to kill the man, even under threat of death, but Tolpaeva, broken by torture and violence, carried out the order. A powerful electric shock instantly killed Shishov. The women were forced to watch the execution, knowing that the same thing could happen to them. One of the captives, Kozikova, tried to escape. She found out that Komen de-energized the staircase when he went down to the bunker himself. The woman waited for the maniac to go down and locked him in one of the rooms in the basement. Together, they tried to get upstairs, but Komen broke down the door and grabbed them both. What followed surpassed all previous abuse. Komen beat the women with inhuman cruelty. He beat them with iron chains all over their bodies, on their heads, on their backs, until they lost consciousness from the pain. When they regained consciousness, the torture continued. The maniac stuck needles under their fingernails. It was a slow, sophisticated torture, each needle causing unbearable pain. The women screamed in agony, but the mattresses on the walls muffled the sounds, and no one upstairs heard anything. After the beatings, Komen offered the captives a choice of punishment. The first option was that he would cut their mouths from ear to ear, turning their faces into masks of horror. The second option was that he would tattoo the word "slave" on their foreheads. The women, in mortal fear, chose the second option. Komen took a homemade tattooing tool and began to burn the word "slave" on each captive's forehead. This was done without anesthesia, and each touch caused excruciating pain. But the maniac didn't stop there. He also tattooed lines under the women's eyes to represent tears. The tattoos healed poorly and festered, turning the captives' faces into a bloody mess. These were marks that were meant to remind them forever of their slave status. The work in the bunker became increasingly exhausting. In addition to 32 robes a day, the women now had to sew vestments for priests and weave icons and coats of arms. Komen even tried to sell a canvas depicting the coat of arms of the local administration, then offered it to the police leadership in Vyatskie Poliani. The maniac's cynicism knew no bounds. He offered goods made by slave labor to the very people who were supposed to protect the law. To increase his income, he installed an electrically heated greenhouse in the bunker and forced the captives to grow cucumbers in it. The women had to work around the clock, tending to the plants between shifts on sewing machines. Tolpaeva committed some offense, and Komen decided to execute her. What he did to her was an act of pure sadism. The maniac tortured the woman for a long time, beating her half to death. He stuck needles under all the nails on her hands and feet, each needle going under the nail plate, causing unbearable pain. Tolpaeva screamed and begged for mercy, but Komen was ruthless. Then he ordered the other captives to inject her with brake fluid. The women were so frightened and overwhelmed that they could not find a vein. Their hands were shaking. Then Tolpaeva, realizing that death was inevitable, offered to drink the poison herself. Komen gave her a glass of brake fluid, and she drank it. Her death was painful and slow. The woman died after 15 hours of terrible convulsions and agony. The other prisoners were forced to watch her die, knowing that this could be their fate. After her death, Komen and Mikiv dragged the body upstairs and threw it into a hole in the ice on the Vyatka River. Another victim, Nazimova, was also executed for disobedience. Komen starved her for several days. The bunker already provided minimal food, but Nazimova was not fed at all. She grew weaker by the hour, losing strength, but this did not elicit pity from the maniac. A few days later, Komen took a funnel, forcibly pried open her jaws, and poured a glass of antifreeze, a car fluid containing a potent poison, into her mouth through the funnel. The woman suffocated. Her insides burned from the poisoning, and her death was agonizing. Komen decided to load Nazimova's body onto a sled and drag it to the doors of the local morgue at night. He was amused by the idea that in the morning, the morgue staff would find the corpse right at the entrance. But the maniac did not make it to the morgue. On his way out of the cooperative, he noticed a passerby, feared that he would be seen, abandoned the body, and fled. A new captive appeared in the bunker, 19-year-old Irina Ganyushkina. One of the surviving enslaved people, Kozakova, developed a rescue plan. She advised the young girl to pretend to be in love with Komen to lull him into a false sense of security. The plan worked. Komen believed in Irina's feelings and even asked her to bear him a child. The maniac tried to inseminate the girl artificially with a syringe. Irina listened in horror to Komen's stories about his plans for the future. He wanted to organize a real slave farm underground with women who would give birth and raise new enslaved people for him. It was a monstrous dream of creating a whole generation of people born in captivity who would never see the sunlight and would work for him all their lives. Shortly before Irina's release, Komen told her something terrible. He said that he was tired of his slaves and was going to fill the bunker with earth along with the remaining captives. This meant that all the women would be buried alive, slowly suffocating and dying in the darkness underground. Irina realized that she couldn't delay. When Komen released her, she was initially afraid to go to the police, thinking that the maniac was watching her and monitoring her movements. But after making sure that everything was okay, she went to the police station and told them everything that had happened to her. On 21st July 1997, a task force arrived at Komen's garage. When the maniac returned, the police immediately arrested him. He denied everything, claiming that there was no one in the bunker. Komen did not mention that the staircase was under lethal voltage, hoping that one of the operatives would die if they touched it. One of the police officers said that he would go downstairs, and if he died from the electric shock, Alexandra would be tried for the murder of a law enforcement officer. Only then did Komen confess about the electricity. When the police turned off the power and went down into the bunker, they saw a scene from hell. Two exhausted women with the word "slave" burned into their foreheads were sitting at sewing machines. They were so emaciated and intimidated that at first they did not believe they were being freed. In the bunker, they found chains with which Komen had shackled his victims, a homemade electric chair, instruments of torture, and traces of blood on the walls. The conditions of detention were inhuman. The survivors told of other prisoners whom the maniac had killed. The investigation established that between 1995 and 1997, 4 women and 2 men were held captive by Komen. 4 of them were killed with particular cruelty. The search for the bodies continued for several months, but not all of the remains were found. Komen and McKeeve dismembered the corpses and buried them in different places. The trial began in 1988. The testimony of the surviving victims painted a picture of systematic abuse, torture, violence, and murder. The examination found Komen to be sane. He understood what he was doing, planned his crimes, and carefully covered his tracks. In 1997, the court sentenced Alexander Komen to life imprisonment. But in 1999, while in prison, Komen committed suicide. He could not bear the conditions in which he now found himself, could not come to terms with the fact that he no longer had power over other people. The surviving victims still have post-traumatic stress disorder. The marks on their foreheads remain forever, reminding them of the nightmare they went through. 22 years after her release, one of the victims met with Komen's accomplice, McKeeve, on a lie detector as part of a television program. She found the strength to look her tormentor in the eye and hear his version of events. This meeting was an attempt for her to close a terrible chapter in her life. Komen's story remains one of the most horrific examples of cruelty and sadism in Russian criminal history.